Thank you very much, Barbara. That's working, okay? It was actually a pleasure to accept your invitation. I always love to be in Switzerland, not only because the country is nice, but because it's a rare feeling to enter a train that then leaves on time. And you cannot imagine how strange that is for us in Germany. So it's really great to be here. I understand my job this morning to be a little bit like John the Baptist. Yeah? I have a little bit to prepare the ground for what then those people who actually have come to hear, namely Jürgen Kaiser, will say about the concrete case of Mozambique. And so this is what I'm going to do. That's the title that they gave for my presentation, the sovereign debt system, how it works and what can be done about it. And except for one short slide of which I'm even not very sure whether it will bring the message across, I will not talk about Mozambique at all. But will, as I said, try to give you a bit of a background where we are at the moment on sovereign debt in the global south, so that a little bit you understand the processes and hopefully the ground is a bit prepared for what Joe and Carlos are going to say later on. I've put a few of our materials outside on the table, so if you want to take things along, what we try to suggest in terms of solving debt crisis in the future, you will be welcome to pick that up. It's not very much actually, because I've been traveling already for a week and ran almost out of material. So without further ado, let's start. I would like to begin with one important sentence that has been more influential on the dealing with sovereign debt crisis in the global south than any other. Is that possible, or am I standing in my own way? I am. Better sit down? Is that okay? All right. And that was a sentence that goes back to a guy called Walter Wriston, who in 1980 used to be chairman of the Citibank. The Citibank doesn't exist anymore. It has changed its name for a reason. But that sentence was extremely important for everything that happened on sovereign debt in the 1970s and in the 1980s. The sentence means that different from companies or individuals, states will always be able to drag out of their economies the resources that are necessary to repay a debt that they may have taken out. And this sentence produced a win-win situation for everybody involved. Yeah, for investors it meant that they had one absolutely safe asset class with which they would run absolutely no risk, which is important to have it when you invest another part of your portfolio into assets that may run a risk but bring higher returns in return, higher interest in return. So this is a perfect opportunity to balance your portfolio. And for states it meant that they could obtain loans from outside, could sell bonds at extremely low interest rates. So it was really a perfect situation for everybody. There was just one small problem with it. It's wrong. What we have here is a graph from a German paper, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, based on an influential book by Ken Rogoff and Carmen Reinhardt. And what these little lifesavers here show is how many percent of the last 200 years individual countries have been in default, have not been able to pay back. And what we see up here is the number of defaults, of countries in default between 1800 and 2000. And I understand that most of you will get German, so I think I don't have to translate details or whatever. What you can see, without going into any details here, what you can easily see is states definitely go bankrupt. Yeah, this is the number of defaults we have had. So it's extremely rare how after such a history of sovereign defaults people could still believe that famous sentence of Mr. Walter Wriston. It must have to do with the situation that it produces, namely that this win-win situation for everybody. You see here, I mean, if you want to look into individual countries, that, unsurprisingly, Greece leads the pack with more than 100 years of the last 200 in default. But you will also find Germany here, for instance, with 13 defaults. That does not only relate to the German separate state, but also what we used to have before 1871. I don't find Switzerland here. Whatever this means. Yeah, this is additionally a list of low-income countries that have been relieved of their debt because they were in default too, so that we can say states definitely do go bankrupt. One small explanatory remark I would like to make before diving deeper into the issue, namely that it's not always very clear what we are talking about when we talk about the debt. And this little graph reveals a little bit what different categories of debt we can have. And what we have here in this horizontal on this horizontal axis here is all public and publicly guaranteed debt, which is relevant for a government budget. What we see here is the debt of a state, yeah, of a central government. And that can be distinguished into its external debt, debt owed to external creditors, and debt owed to the domestic creditors. Yeah, a debt can sell its bonds to foreign investors or to people here in Switzerland. That's what your government is doing. And on this vertical axis here, we have all the debt that is relevant for the balance of payments. Yeah, the debt of an economy. This is the debt of a state, this is the debt of an economy. The debt of an economy can be public, it can be the debt of the state, but it can also be the private, non-guaranteed debt of the private sector. This is an important distinction that will also be relevant for Mozambique, as we will see later on. So, when people talk about the debt of the Global South, for instance, then it makes sense to look into what people are actually talking about. Are they talking about the debt of a state? Or are they talking about the debt of an economy? Yeah? That gets a bit blurred later on, but later on. No. Who are the creditors of countries in the Global South? This is just a very stylized presentation in order to give you an idea. When we look back into 1975, that was before the start of what we call the Third World Debt Crisis in 1982 with the Mexican default, then we see that most of the debt was red, and red in this graph means public creditors, multilateral like the World Bank and the IMF, or bilateral public creditors. So that's where states were indebted to other states or to multilateral institutions. And here we have, as an example, the situation in 2012 of all countries in the Global South, all what we call the developing world. And we see that the profile has changed, and that the black part, which means debt owed to foreign banks and foreign bondholders, has increased strongly. And this tendency has even more increased since 2012. So this is one of the huge tendencies that we are having at the moment, that not like back in the 1980s and 90s when the campaigns around debt relief started, the debt was owed to public entities, but it's mostly owed to private entities. We see this here again. This goes a little bit on to 2014, which also makes the distinction between the debt of the public sector and the private sector, again for all developing countries, low-income countries as well as emerging markets. And the black line is the debt of the public sector, and the red line is the debt of the private sector. So the public sector is still slightly, the debt owed by the public sector, by the states, by the governments, is still slightly higher in 2014 than the debt owed by private companies in a country like Mozambique or whatever you want to think about. But if we look at what people actually have to pay for this debt, then we see that there's a marked difference. Namely that since the middle of the last decade, the debt service, the repayments and the interests that the debtors have to make on their external debt is a lot higher regarding their debt to the private sector. And if you now recall that the debt, that particularly this part of the external debt is on the rise, then you see that the debt becomes more and more a burden on the shoulders of indebted states in the global south. Yeah, this is one of the big tendencies that we are seeing at the moment, and it goes on after 2014. I just don't have a nice graph about it at hand. So these are the global trends. We have a strong privatization of development finance, which implies that there is less development orientation and more belief that whatever the private sector invests in a country in the global south will ultimately serve the people and the development of the countries. You can believe that or not. We also see a strong focus on resource extraction. This is something that will also come back to us when we look into Mozambique, but it goes for a huge number of countries in the global south that, different from what the public sector used to finance, namely things like social infrastructure, now there's a strong focus on resource extraction by the various creditors that move into, let's say, Africa, for instance. That's not only Western loan making, but it also refers, of course, to creditors like China. Within the private sector, we have a shift from bank loans, which was the major instrument used for loan making by the private sector to low-income countries in the 1980s, to bonds. Yeah, it's not totally new, because bonds have always been there, and the first big debt crisis of the 20th century, back in 1910, 1912, 1914, they were almost entirely based on bonds, but then they shifted to banks, and now we are back in the bond business. With the result that there are ever more complex creditor structures also in low-income countries. Yeah, in the past, typical African low-income countries would have 80% of its debt owed to the World Bank, the IMF, and the African Development Bank. And ever since the debt relief initiatives of the 1980s, we have an ever stronger role of the private sector and ever more complex creditor structures. Yeah? If you want to renegotiate your debt, you need to do it with all your creditors, and that is even the more difficult if you do not deal with a few banks like Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, whoever you have, but you have to deal with a multitude of bondholders, which could frankly be anybody of you. Sometimes you owe bonds of countries in the global south without knowing it, if you are invested into a sort of investment fund or whatever. And we have the emergence of the so-called vulture fund model, as bonds tend to be a lot more liquid than official claims. Then we recently had the phenomenon that investors like hedge funds bought with a huge discount distressed debt of countries in the global south and then sued for full repayments. Yeah, that's a very risky business model, but it has been prominently successful in the case of Argentina 3 years ago. And finally, we have the public promotion of private development financing. Maybe some of you have heard about the G20 initiative, which is called the Compact with Africa, which that was one of the major proposals by the German government under its presidency during its G20 presidency, namely to encourage German and generally Western investors to invest into African infrastructure. And they called this the Compact with Africa. So, countries in crisis, where are we at the moment? I just want to give you a brief overview. I know that this is not particularly well readable here. This is, oh, it's not readable at all. This is from, you know, Elassia does every year what we call our flagship publication, the Schulden Report 2017. I would have loved to bring some for you, but I ran out of them. I'm sorry for this. That happens when you travel so long. This is an overview of assessment that we make every year based on World Bank data on countries regarding their debt situation. And what this, even if you can't read the individual names, but the message in this is that the higher a country is here on the vertical axis, the bigger are its debt problems. And the more to the left it finds itself, the more things have improved in the last 5 years. The more it is to the right, the more the situation has worsened. Yeah? And what you can easily see is that this is not balanced. I mean, what we have seen since the beginning of this decade is a huge shift to the right. And even if you look at the report that we did a year before, then you see that this was still a lot more balanced. And this has to do with those trends that I spoke about before of private capital moving into countries in the global south massively. You can find this on the internet. If you go to www.erlassia.de, then you can download the whole Schulden Report 2017. We are already working on the new edition because the new World Bank data have just come out last week. So that will be out sometime early next year, and most probably the trend will even push countries more to the right. Yeah? So it's no exaggeration at all to say that there is a new debt crisis in the global south coming our way. That's what also the IMF said. Before coming here, I was in Geneva. There was an UNCTAD debt management conference, and we spoke to a lot of people under various UN organizations. We spoke to the IMF, and it's not often that we agree with the IMF, but at that point we are all pretty clear that something is building up and coming our way. And as you'll see in the next section that I want to draw on, we are not very well prepared. Okay, now I try something that one should never do during such a presentation. And it's even more of a risk than the thing that you saw before, namely to present you this data mud. Yeah. give me a minute. I just tell you why I did it anyway, although it's almost not readable. This is from one of the most important documents that we have in our work, namely the regular Article 4 consultations that the IMF does with every country. And this graph here, this table, is what you could call the centerpiece of the analysis that they are doing. And this was from the 2015 Article 4 that they did on Mozambique. And I do not want to go into details on Mozambique because Carlos and Joe will do that a lot better than I can do. But I want to show you how the trend works that I talked about before. You know, up here we have a line that says external debt. That's the total external debt of the countries in percent of the GDP. And those of you that have the eyes of an eagle can see that we were in the range of 70 to 80% in 2012 to 2014. And then from 2015 onward we moved slightly above 100, which is already alarming. You may know that the Maastricht criteria for the EU are 60. And it ends in 2019 with 120, and then all of a sudden in 2020 it jumps to 166. And if you now wonder where this comes from, then you can see that the change in external debt is big here in 2015, and then it's pretty modest here, and then it jumps up 40% of GDP between 2019 and 2020. And this is being matched by the next line below, which is the non-debt creating flow, what the economists call foreign direct investment. Yeah, debt is a loan that someone gives to the state or the company, but foreign direct investment means that an external investor provides money and gets the shares of the entity that he's actually invested in. He becomes the owner of it. And again, this is moderate here, all the years. And then here in 2020 we have the jump by 40%. And all this has to do with the gas exploration before the Mozambican coast. And the message in these barely readable lines is that by 2020, due to the huge investment into the gas sector, Mozambique will be about as indebted as Greece is today. This is way beyond anything that either ourselves, nor the IMF, nor the World Bank consider to be sustainable. And that the financing, in the first place, will come through loans taken out, and then you will have a huge shift into foreign direct investment, and that means that the ownership will mostly be with foreign companies. Yeah? If you want to put it a bit bluntly, then in 2020 the Mozambican economy will be hardly more than an appendix to its own gas sector. This is the future of the country. I think that's important to keep that in mind when we think about individual deals like the hidden data and everything. Okay, how can we deal with that situation? That was all quite depressing, I presume. And what I want to do in the next part of the presentation is to show you a little bit about what the alternatives have been and where the problems are for a country regarding how to deal with that situation. And in order to not speak all the time, I would like to show you a little movie that we have been doing for educational purposes at Basel. And it's a novel, it's like a soap opera, you will see that. I already apologize for the typo in the intro.
And here we've opened the case against Dikembe Braziko for reckless failure to repay a loan. Mr. Attorney, the floor is yours. Thank you, Your Honour. First of all, I'd like to point out that the creditors have shown a high degree of patience. For a long time they hoped that the defendant might come to his senses and avoid a trial like this one. However, like any citizen of his state, the defendant owes his creditors their full dues. Thanks to interest and compound interest, his debt stock keeps rising daily. But Mr. Braziko has literally done nothing to change this. Indeed, on the contrary, he knows he should produce pineapples for export. But what does he do instead? He produces millet. Millet for his own consumption. Millet which will never reach the market. Rather than assume responsibility for the economy as a whole, he just muddles around as if it were the millet gruel on his table which made the world go round. Mr. Attorney, please. He could do that, no problem. Were this just his own business? Were it not for the fates of many creditors who depend on him? The word creditors, Your Honour, ladies and gentlemen in the jury, is derived from credere, to believe. They believed in him. They wanted to help him out of his misery. They provided him with considerable amounts of money, and they do not even demand gratitude in return. Just a bit. Just a little bit of effort. Thank you.
The debt crisis of the Third World, still an unresolved problem. On average, each person in the countries of the South owes northern creditors the equivalent of a full annual income.
In fact, many countries of the South still pay more to their creditors in debt service than they spend on the health and education of their people. More than 1 billion people still live below the poverty line, and every day more than 30,000 children die from malnourishment, lack of health care, or preventable diseases. That's nearly 21 a minute. The debt of the so-called developing countries has a long history.
It started in the 16th century with the genocide committed by the European colonizers in the newly discovered Americas. The plundering of Latin America's riches using African slaves contributed to Europe's growing wealth and to the dependency of these countries, which later on would be referred to as the Third World.
By the 19th century, the colonizers had managed to gear the colony's economies completely towards their own interests. And this didn't change in the 20th century, when most countries of the Third World secured their independence from the colonial powers. Exports of raw materials and agricultural products remained the major sources of income. No national industries could grow.
The debt crisis of the developing countries emerged, which continues until today. In the 70s, when oil prices rose, the oil-producing nations deposited their newfound dollars in rich country banks. These banks began desperately looking for investment opportunities. What resulted could be called a credit tourism towards the south. Rich country banks lent money without really caring that in many cases it went into useless projects.
In the early 80s, the system collapsed. President Reagan financed his massive armament build-up through loan financing, and this pushed interest rates up dramatically worldwide. Many developing countries could not service their debts at these interest rates and found themselves in a debt trap.
Attempts to repay their debts by increasing exports of raw materials and agricultural products soon backfired because nearly all poor countries pursued this same strategy. This caused world prices to fall rapidly. Incomes did not rise but actually fell. New loans had to be taken out and the global gap between rich and poor kept growing. However, the members of the so-called Paris Club, who negotiate individual countries' debt problems here in the French Treasury, could hardly care less.
Defence, the floor is yours. Your Honour, honourable members of the jury, Mr. Attorney, my client is not a rich man. Through hard labour he grows a little millet for his family from stony soil, and he's an honourable man. His debts are of great concern to him. Just now he's asked me, why do I, Dikembe Brazil, have debts? I have no car, I have no TV, but I have got debts. And that causes him pain. I object. Your Honour, the personal feelings of the defendant have no place in this court. Defence, please get to the point. So, let us consider the situation very objectively. We must not forget the old saying, he who condemns his debtor to death will have to pay the funeral. That, Mr. Attorney, will remain to be seen. Regarding the personal situation of the defendant, we have a witness. Mr. Miller, please, to the witness stand. And nothing but the truth. Mr. Miller, as a representative of the International Monetary Fund, you've been investigating the economic situation of Mr. Brazica. What is your conclusion? Well, my experience has led me to believe that in every household you can identify considerable potential for savings as well as idle income opportunities. Let me refer to one particularly dramatic example. Mr. Brazica not only sends his 12-year-old son to school, but also his daughters of 8 and 9, withholding their nimble fingers from the production process, not to mention the cost of school attendance. Your Honour, I would like to briefly consult with my client. Mr. Brazica, you should have told me. I am your lawyer. How can you attack me like that? Oh God, we're doomed. No, do not say anything. Simply do not say anything. Please continue. The 77-year-old grandmother who also lives in the house not only sits idle all day, in fact she sleeps on a mattress which has been bought especially for her. Mr. Brazica's wife looks after the 4 small children all day and thus is also unavailable for any meaningful activity. Oh no, it's going to be a tough job to get you out of this mess. For mosquito nets alone, the family has spent nearly $15, allegedly in order to prevent malaria. In my view, they've done this simply to avoid being bitten. Moreover, I recently found drugs against tuberculosis in the house. But worst of all is Mr. Brazica's dedication to the production of millet, thus avoiding the necessities of the world market.
Mr. Judge, Your Honour.
I object. That's how leading questions begin. Sustained.
The Paris Club is truly exclusive. So exclusive that any member of the public present during its meetings would clearly trouble them. Without any formal rules, much less an international mandate, the most important creditors of the Third World, the governments of the rich industrialized countries, meet to decide not only on their own claims, their decisions also set the standards for other creditors, such as private banks.
If a debtor country runs into payment problems, this is where restructurings or partial reduction of the debt are negotiated, provided the creditors conclude that the actual claims are in reality uncollectible. The debtor country is listened to, but decision-making is the exclusive privilege of the creditors.
Even the slightest restructuring is only granted on the basis of an adjustment program which the debtor country needs to agree with the International Monetary Fund. The most important conditions in the IMF's programs are
complete opening up of the country to world trade,
dismantling of subsidies, particularly for basic food staples,
radical cuts in budget spending.
For the people in the affected countries, these programs are having severe consequences. Hunger and poverty grow, while basic foodstuffs become more expensive. Diseases thought to be eradicated return, where the state is forced to cut back on preventative health care. And many parents cannot send their kids to school when they are confronted with school fees.
All this is nothing the Paris Club would consider in its negotiations, nor is the creditors' co-responsibility for the South's debt. Lenders of the 70s, 80s and 90s knew pretty well that loans were given for completely oversized projects, for corrupt dictators, or for arms purchases, with correspondingly low rates of return.
The Paris Club's internal structure guarantees that these facts will not surface. Formally, the IMF and the World Bank assume the role of independent witnesses and even defendants of a debtor. But in reality, everything remains under the control of the creditors. Everything stays within the family.
Defense, you may now question the witness. Okay, now watch this. Mr. Miller, you claim to be a recognized expert? Of course, I have all the necessary qualifications. Mr. Miller, you claim to have scrutinized my client's budget? I have. Mr. Miller, you seriously claim that from his household, characterized by hard work and selflessness, more efforts to satisfy the creditor's claims could be expected? One could pursue more meaningful activities, even forgo some things? That would be possible. You're the expert. No further questions. So may I now ask you to sum up? Honourable members of the jury, I admit my client is no angel. His willingness to adapt himself to the necessities of world markets has been underdeveloped. Therefore, it would be reckless to demand an acquittal. However, I repeat, in dubio pro realitas, provide Mr. Brasico with a chance to repair the damage he has caused. In the end, this will pay off. Thank you. Given the overwhelming evidence, any further explanations from my side are unnecessary. So, the last word is with the defendant.
Your Honour, I want to...
My client wants to say that this High Court may judge in its ultimate wisdom over the fate of a poor sinner.
No, that is not at all what I want to say.
Mr. Brasico, do we really want to make everything even worse? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, please leave your deliberations.
Any sustainable solution to the debt crisis of the Third World needs to provide the debtor countries with the opportunity for economic recovery through an international insolvency procedure.
If a country is unable to pay its debt, it declares itself insolvent, like any private company. An international procedure begins, which functions like this.
First, the process is public. All claims must be tabled. This inevitably raises questions regarding the creditor's co-responsibility.
Second, debtor and creditors negotiate as equals. Both nominate an equal number of judges. These in turn nominate an additional judge who will cast the deciding vote where judges are split equally.
Third, resources which the debtor country requires to secure such basic needs as health, education, food security and basic infrastructure cannot be touched.
Fourth, ordinary people also get the right to be heard before a decision is made, since they're the ones most affected.
And finally, if former dictatorial or corrupt regimes have stolen wealth, this is traced as far as possible and made available for debt repayment. Following these guidelines, the impartial jury will decide how much an indebted country must pay back and how much debt will be cancelled. Resources freed up in this way can be used for improving the prospects of the population. with the assistance of independent unions, churches or non-governmental organisations. An institution like the Paris Club will then certainly be superfluous.
So, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? Yes, Your Honour. So, what's your decision? Guilty. 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 Thank you. In the name of the law, the following sentence is passed. The court finds Dikembe Braziko guilty of all charges. He and his family are condemned to 30 years of severe austerity. Mr. Braziko will immediately start to produce pineapples for export for the benefit of society at large. By the way, the necessary fertilizers are to be purchased from Bisanto Incorporated. Millet production will be restricted to Mr. Braziko's free time, indeed to night time, but only on soil which is unsuitable for pineapple production. The two daughters, rather than learn unnecessary things at school that they'll never need in real life, will look after their little brothers and sisters to free their mother to work in the fields. Tuberculosis drugs are to be withdrawn and the mosquito nets and mattress are to be sold. The revenue will be used to repay debt. Grandma must again sleep on the soil, which is local custom anyway. Should these measures not suffice to meet the creditor's justified claims, the court reserves the right to take further action against Dikembe Braziko and his family. No appeal admitted. Case closed. No, do not thank me. It's just my job to do the best for you.
Hey! Alternatives are possible.
Okay, as you may have seen, that was originally a German film, and it's dubbed in English, so if you ever want to make use of it, it's available on our website. Have you been aware of how many actors there were in the film? Two, that's right, yes. Okay, you got the message. What I want to do in the last part of the presentation is just to tell you where we are standing in the reform process. As the film tried to show, I hope that it was made clear that there is a deeply flawed system where debtors cannot expect to be treated justly once they run into payment problems, and that a reform is needed to have a new system that is based on the rule of law, which respects the human rights of the debtor too. And on the last few slides that I want to show you is to give you an idea of where we are in that process, because we, like many colleagues in other countries, including in Switzerland by the way, have been working for such an international insolvency framework. And in 2001 to 2003 it was even the IMF who came up with a proposal for such a framework, which for a short time looked pretty good in order to be implemented. We, from our end, we fiercely criticized it because the IMF put itself in the role of the impartial judge, which is not exactly the meaning of the word impartiality. But then the whole process was frustrated in 2003 by the then Bush administration, so that failed. We have had several attempts from the United Nations in order to establish a system of an impartial renegotiation of sovereign debt, notably from the Trade and Development Report 1988 from UNCTAD. And the most recent effort was a document that is available on the UNCTAD website, which is called the Roadmap and Guide for a Sovereign Debt Workout, which is something like a guide for a step-by-step process, as the film has already been shown, how could such a sovereign insolvency framework function. It was worked out by a little working group where some renowned academics and also a few poor NGOs like myself were allowed to participate. Switzerland was quite active on this. It started with a motion in the Ständerat, the little chamber, in 1989, and the latest effort that we took with the Aktion Finanzplatz when it was still existing, which was extremely proactive and helpful on this, was the Postulat Gutswiller that called upon the Swiss government to promote the idea of an international sovereign insolvency framework in 2013. Who's interested in following this up, I'm happy to share the documentation on this whole process, but it will also be on the files of the Ständerat, of course. We had a very, very promising process in the United Nations General Assembly, the G77, which is the community of developing countries in the global south. It's only called G77, actually it's 134 countries at the moment, and it's formally called the G77 and China. Under Argentinian leadership, they proposed a resolution which was adopted by the UN General Assembly that within 1 year, the General Assembly itself should work out a sovereign insolvency framework, which meant until September 2015. We had fierce opposition against this from the two other groups in the United Nations General Assembly, one is the USCANs, that's Japan, United States, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, but also from the EU. Switzerland was a little bit in the middle, but unfortunately not proactive. We had always hoped that in that process we could get Switzerland to take, based on the most recent Postulat Gutzwiller and the debates we had in the Ständerat, to take a more positive position and to break up the northern blockade, but unfortunately they didn't dare to do this. And then in September 2015 at the UN General Assembly, all ended up with establishing something like 9 principles for sovereign debt workout, which is not a very strong document, so nothing that would really be implementable. So the process needs to go on. And I put this more in grey because it was not really much of a big process. We also did put a lot of work into getting the G20, which is not the old industrialized countries club like the G7 and G8, but it also has a major participation from leading emerging markets in it. We tried to push them through some public action to at least become aware of the build-up of a new sovereign debt crisis, and to also develop something like guidelines for a debt workout process. But the document that came actually out, which is a bit hidden on the G20 website, but you can find it, or I can share the link to it, was the operational guidelines for sustainable finance. That includes a few nice notions like the shared responsibility between debtors and creditors, but it's not very much operational when it comes to debt workouts. Finally, what's important for this whole process is that there is more than one option. What you have seen in the movie, and also implicitly in the last slide that I had, was the idea to work towards a global mechanism that would replace the infamous Paris Club and the mechanisms that are totally controlled by the creditors through something that would be a global mechanism at world level and available to any country. But we have learned that this is not the only way to move things forward. It is one way, but it makes also sense to work towards debt relief for individual debtor countries. So what we try to do is to get involved into the processes when individual countries do have to renegotiate their debts, and then to bring the elements of an impartial rule of law-based process into this, like impartial assessment of the need for debt relief, impartial decision-making, and a comprehensive process where you do not have to negotiate one part of the debt in Paris, the other one in London, the third one not at all. Yeah. And we try, debt relief for individual countries. We tried to do this, for instance, on Nigeria in 2005. Then we tried to learn from the initiative that we actually accomplished in 1996 and 1999 around the Cologne G8 summit, which was the so-called heavily indebted poor countries initiative, which provided, in fact, debt relief to up to now 36 low-income countries in the global south, including Mozambique. And for some of them, not at the beginning, but ultimately, when it was enhanced to cancelling most of the debt to multilateral creditors in 2005, then it really did provide countries with the opportunity of a fresh start. And if you today look at the debt indicators of low-income countries as a whole, you see that they are far below, for instance, what European countries actually have in debt in relation to external, to its economic capacities. So it made sense that you looked into debt relief opportunities for those countries that most needed it. And at the moment, we are looking particularly, together with people, for instance, at the Global Fund, at the IMF, to countries which are under external shocks. The IMF and the World Bank have provided that relief for countries under the Ebola crisis, three countries in West Africa, for instance. We have been pressuring them very strongly, or as strongly as we could, to provide this also to countries that have suffered from the recent hurricane season in the Caribbean. You may know that a few of the very small, tiny islands in the Eastern Caribbean have almost entirely been devastated, like Barbuda and Dominica, from the recent hurricanes. Still, all the creditors keep collecting money from them, from a country that has suffered losses to the amount of 200% of its GNI in just one night. So that's where we try to focus on something like a heavily indebted Caribbean countries initiative, or countries like Nepal, which have suffered from an earthquake, our regional debt relief initiative. And on the creditor side, people have started to talk about state contingent debt instruments, which means bonds whose repayment is linked to the economic success of the countries. We are still not quite sure about how useful that option is, but these are all options that are under discussion at the moment, and you may wish to pick and think and consider what could be relevant for Mozambique. So that's where I am. I hope I'm still in time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jürgen Kaiser. We are left with 15 minutes for questions and debate.
Just one question of clarification. You said it's a trend towards bonds instead of loans. Could you explain the difference and why bonds are worse than loans?
They are not necessarily worse. They are different. The foremost difference from the perspective of the debtor is that a loan has implies that you have a fixed repayment schedule where you actually have to honor interest payments and repayments at a how do you call it? I'm getting out of my English. Sorry. It's sorry, I forgot it. Also ein Kredit muss zurückbezahlt werden in dem Maße, wie es am Anfang vereinbart worden ist. Wir machen einen festen Rückzahlungsplan aus. Und ein Bond hat in der Regel eine Bullet-Rückzahlung, das heißt, man zahlt zu einem ganz bestimmten Zeitpunkt den ganzen Betrag zurück, oder man vereinbart, dass die Rückzahlung über einen längeren Zeitraum stattfindet mit einer festgelegten oder einem variablen Zinssatz. Ich weiß nicht, ob das jetzt wirklich klar war. Kann das jemand besser erklären? Ich mache das nachher noch, ich erkläre das nachher noch. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions really. One is your description somehow suggested that there is little scope for individual countries' policies to deal with the whole situation, which is a depressing kind of conclusion. So wanted to ask you if that is really the case, if you have any examples of countries in the developing world that have taken a different course and have been able to manage the situation in spite of the odds against it.
Okay. Yeah, that would not be a right impression, because it really, I mean, the outcome of a debt renegotiation very much belongs on the balance of power that we're having, right? And it is an enormous difference whether you are a tiny country in the Caribbean that has practically no voting power whatsoever anywhere, at UN, whatever you think, or if you are a country that has political leverage. If we look in the more recent past, what comes to my mind regarding countries that had leverage and then got better deals for them, at least than had been suggested before. You have a case like Pakistan, Russia, yeah, so it obviously pays off to have nuclear weapons when you renegotiate your debt. Nigeria had a very interesting story, because Nigeria was on the first HIPIC list of this debt relief initiative in 1996, was then kicked off when it became a fragile democracy after the dictatorship of Sani Abacha, and because then debt relief could not be withheld anymore because of Sani Abacha and the notorious governance there, so they then kicked it off the list under a pretext. But then it managed to get a relatively good deal compared to peers. Yeah? So you have individual countries. I mean, the most famous or prominent individual deal was not a country in the global south, but that was Germany in 1953. When, due to the constellations of the Cold War, the German government of the time was very effective in urging Western creditors to forgo the claims they had from the Marshall Plan and from loans that the German Reich had taken out before the Nazi takeover in order to pay the reparations after World War I. So that was a huge debt at that time. And as Germany filled the interests of the Western creditors, saying that we are the showcase country against the evil communism in the East, so we need to be put in a better position, and then they got an extremely generous and in some way even genial debt relief under the London Debt Accord of 1953. There was, for instance, just to mention that because that's one of our favorite topics. It's, I mean, the sheer debt relief was not even the most progressive thing about it, but you had a clause in it which allowed Germany to actually cease debt payments to individual creditor countries if Germany did not have a trade surplus. Yeah, imagine this for a second to be applied to countries in the global south or even to Greece. The problem would have been solved. Yeah, I mean, the creditors would have, it would be on their shoulders to make sure that they buy enough from Greece or from Mozambique or wherever you want to put them. And otherwise, forget about your claims on the country.
That was a very productive question. Do we have more questions like that?
Thank you very much for your nice presentation. Please, can you share with us like the ways and the extent in which the debtor countries are involved in finding out the solution for their debt crisis?
In which way they are themselves involved, or?
Yes, it's like the one who is finding out the solution for the debt crisis is the debtors themselves, or even the creditor countries are also, I mean, like how the debtor and the creditor countries share together finding out the ways for the debt crisis.
Yeah. As you have seen, what we are having at the moment is completely skewed, yeah, and it's entirely dominated by the creditors. This is why we put the same actor into all the roads, yeah, in order to demonstrate in the end it's always the US, Germany, Japan, and a few other usual suspects who make all the decisions. And in such a situation, if you are not Pakistan or Russia or otherwise have nuclear weapons or other leverage over the creditors, you're in an extremely weak position. So what debtor countries time and again have been trying to do was to group together. There was the famous proposal by Fidel Castro in the late 1980s to form something like a debtors cartel in order to counterbalance the debtors club. But that never worked out, not least because the debtors, the poorer countries were also debtors creditors to each other. So that united front was never really possible. So, but what they tried to do was to instigate processes like the one in the United Nations General Assembly in order to establish something like a legal framework, because the law normally is there to protect the poorer, the weaker against the stronger. So they thought that taking recourse to international law would actually help them. We have not advanced very much on this, so the old system keeps being intact. And that's why most of the countries, the debtor countries in the global south find themselves thrown back into a situation where they have to negotiate individually. The individual delegations go to Paris, have to present their case, and are sent out of the rooms, and then the creditors decide among themselves what they do about them. That's a very inefficient and extremely unfair situation, obviously.
One of the things that comes up in the film that you have talked about is lender liability. Because in domestic law in most of our countries, a bank has a responsibility that the loan should be reasonable. So in England, if I go into my bank and say, I'm a gambler, I've lost all my money, but I'm surely going to win next time, lend me some money, and I don't repay the loan, in English law, it's the bank's responsibility for having been stupid enough to lend me the loan, lend me the money. In international law, as your film shows, if the IMF or the World Bank or bondholders are stupid enough to lend the money, as with the Mozambican bondholders at the moment, then they can still claim repayment for the entirely stupid loan. Whereas in domestic law, in I think most of our countries, that's not the case. So the issue really is we're not applying our own domestic legal thinking to our own banks when they make international loans.
If there's no other question, I'll just briefly come back to this loan bond issue. I'm very shameful about that.
Sorry for that.
No one should be able to explain that. You know, one of the important differences is, I mean, a loan is just a loan like you get one when you are in the pub and you can't pay and your friend helps you out. This is practically what a loan looks like formally, not by intention. And a bond is a tradable instrument. A bond is a payment promise that you make to whoever holds it. And this is why you have a secondary market for bonds. And bonds can float. They can rise in value, or beyond the 100% face value, or they can, of course, be very much downtrodden. This was behind the vulture fund business model that I mentioned before, when Argentine bonds traded like 30% or even below that on the dollar international markets, and hedge fund investors bought them and then sued for 100%. This would not have been possible with loans, but that was one of the things that you could do with international bonds, and that's common. I mean, this is why they are made for, because they have liquid markets.
I have a question. The fact that the interest rates here in the global north are very low, and the countries in the global south are so-called bad debtors and pay higher interest rates. Does this have an influence on the fact that so much capital is flowing to the south?
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to go more into detail when this slide came with the compact with Africa. You know, the compact with Africa was an initiative by the G20, particularly driven by the German government, And the rhetoric about this is that the poor countries in Africa do not have adequate infrastructure. And so we need to do something about it. This is the rhetoric around it. Yeah? You see pictures of non-existing roads or of poor schoolings and everything. And so you need to mobilize the private sector into investing into infrastructure in Africa. This is the narrative of the compact with Africa. But you can raise a very simple question about this, and that brings me to what you asked about. Why are they doing it now? Yeah, the infrastructure has been poor in Africa ever since you have had independent states, or even longer, of course. Yeah? Why are they now promoting private investment into Africa? And this is exactly the point that we have been making. Yeah, because now, you know, I don't know what your pension systems here in Switzerland are, but in Germany we have seen a huge restructuring of our pension systems from the state pay-as-you-go system that we used to have ever since the end of the Second World War to a privatized, capital-based system. And this means that Allianz and Deutsche Bank and a lot of other huge investors have sold these pension coupons to the populace. And these imply payments like 3%, 4% in that range to the broader populace. And these markets are huge. So if you now provide our finance minister with overnight money and you get less back the next morning than you have put in the evening, and you need to pay your own creditors like 3%, you have a real problem. And the politics in Germany, and I think other Western countries also, are extremely concerned about that setup. So they have to look out, where can we actually gain the 3, 4, 5% that we need? And that leads them automatically to the global south. Now they cannot say, okay, we need to ratchet all these higher interest rates that we can make in Africa and Latin America. They need to say, okay, we care about your infrastructure. And that's what they do. But don't let yourself be fooled. I mean, this is not about infrastructure in Africa. This is about allowing Allianz to pay Riester. That's it. And that's basically, I mean, that's the same constellation, you would have seen this in the film, that actually produced what we called the debt crisis of the third world. Low interest rates in the global north, falling commodity prices, irresponsible leaders in the global south who ran huge deficits, and creditors at the time, then it was still the banks, you know, the ones, the guy with the little suitcases that you saw in the film. Today it's a bit more sophisticated. And the creditorism started. This is how those crises emerge. And we see it happening before our eyes.
Any other question? If not, we have been served with a heavy load. Not so much in terms of how to understanding, but in terms of what it means. And I think we have deserved a break. There is coffee. We will be back in half an hour. Thank you very much.